first of all, before I even begin with what I've come to speak about, I just want to say it's an honor and a privilege to be here. As Nathan kind of touched on, this work is very close to my heart and to the work that I do in the numerous roles and positions that I'm fortunate enough to occupy. So to be here today and to share these ideas with you and to talk about these ideas from my perspective is a real honor. I just want to start off before I even touch on the meat and bones of what I'm speaking of, contextualizing me. So I am a mental health professional. I work with Crossroads, specifically Project Zazie, around intersectional masculinity work, particularly around race, culture, identity, history, and using them as a building block for self-awareness, self-efficacy, and self-confidence. That's the work that I do in that mental health space. And I'm also involved in the higher education space, unpacking, deconstructing, and reconstructing ideas of masculinity, and particularly these ideas of decolonization. That's a big overarching theme in all of the work that I do, and you'll hear about that today as I speak from my perspective. This is my perspective, so please don't take what I say as a universal truth or something that I try and pass on as the only way to do it. I'm contextualizing that because hopefully that will make sense as we kind of progress further on into this conversation. These are my perspectives. So some of it may resonate, some of it may prickle, some of it may unearth and kind of ignite some thoughts and ideas of your own. Sit with them, reflect on them, and I'm sure you'll have space and time to unpack it as we go through. So, I recently had the honor of delivering a TEDx talk on masculinity. And within this talk, I opened this talk with a statement. I meet with death a few times per week, and death asks me, why so many men? Now, this opening statement wasn't just an acknowledgement and reference point to the suicidal ideation or the suicide attempts that we deal with in our work. It was also a nod to the general lifelessness that I see when working with young men through their explorative work around their masculinities. Lifeless not because they are dead inside, but because they are projecting a masculinity often that is not in reference to the truth that they hold in their hearts. And we talk of truth, authenticity, and self-awareness quite a lot. These are incredibly important building blocks and anchors to navigate the uncertainty, the volatility, and at times the chaos of the world around us. But without these anchors, without this awareness, it's very easy to get swept into what I call motions of the mainstream and become merged with ideas and ideals that aren't serving truth and lived experiences. And from my vantage point, or from my therapeutic seat, if you will, many of our young men are being swept away. They are being swept into discourse, they are being swept into behaviors, ideas, and ideals of patriarchal masculinity that centers contempt, power, and control at the center of everything that this man or this projection wants to do and how it wants to express itself. They are swept into an ego protection, status accumulation, misogynistic preservation, and gender degradation that is embedded into all of us as men and has been embedded into all of us as men for generations. They are swept into the defensiveness that swallows accusations but spits out accountability. Swept into this cognitive rigidity that sees constructive, loving, healing, compassionate criticism as part of a wider conspiracy to eradicate masculinity. And for me, we often see masculinity one way, from one angle that does not account for what I call the kaleidoscope of difference that masculine presentation is and always has been. From the pre-colonial presentations found in our ancestors' nations that were not concerned with binaries but only with liberation. Liberation from rules, boxes, and frameworks that do exist today. Liberated from the invisible yet restricted forces that influence what we should wear or what we should say. That remove the potential for experimentation and the opportunity to truthfully display. Because to me, Masculinities at their core should be playful, because they are and always have been a creation. But masculinity is also a projection of the wider structural space that it is constructed within. We create and perpetuate masculinities as a culture, but what we create are often carbon copies of the very ideas and ideals that we are trying to dismantle. Through reinforcing unacknowledged or unidentified ideas and beliefs, through this apathy in the face of violence, not just towards ourselves, but others around us, and this encouragement of conformity over courageous, truthful authenticity. I personally speak of patriarchal masculinity as a fungus, as a killer, as one of the biggest tyrants and oppressors, the most sophisticated weapons that humanity has ever created or produced. And it thrives in the minds of young masculinities. Because it is often unacknowledged, unexplored, unidentified across time and space. It has become such a part of our lives that it is just perceived as normal, as human, as masculine, which makes treating this fungus and the ideas that come with it incredibly difficult. And patriarchal masculinity is absent from our curriculums most of the time. It's absent from our classrooms, but it is very present in virtually all elements of our life. It's present in our homes, it's coming through our smartphones, it's in our conceptualizations of reality. But without identifying and acknowledging this fungus that I speak of, we are all facilitating its infected capacities. But where did the fungus come from? What allowed it to take such a strong hold on our minds, our bodies, and our cultures? How did patriarchal masculinity become mainstream, the norm? Now, this was a comment that came from my TEDx talk. I mentioned these ideas, but there was a question. I take it as a sort of constructive piece of feedback. What is this fungus, and where does it come from? How does it become part of our lives? I'm going to attempt to answer this question in this particular piece of work now. To me, the stronghold of patriarchal masculinity, as we know it, as we experience it, arguably took place during the formation of Western civilization as we know it today, one of the most influential periods of time in the formation of Western civilization, but to me, as an indigenous person, one of the darkest times as well, the Enlightenment period. And I have a question to reflect on just for a moment. I'm not going to ask anyone to answer this, but what happens when you have predominantly rich, white, middle-class men deciding or defining the prevalent and powerful ideas of a society and culture that are not in any way separate from the racialized, gendered, and classified selves that produce this knowledge? What happens is, you assign power and influence to men, the white middle-class male mind in particular, and you attribute power and influence to these male bodies and minds. You create a system where gendered power dynamics slowly over time become normalized, racialized, and reinforced. Not just in the locality of our immediate space though, across the world. There is nothing normal about men having political, cultural, bodily, or financial power. But it has been normalized through scientific discourse. It has been normalized through the manipulation of sacred religious texts. It has been normalized through the desecration of indigenous ideas and values. It has been normalized through the perpetuation of a singular cultural archetype and the extermination of ideas that dared to challenge the singularity. Take my ancestors, my bloodline as an immediate example. Matriarchal influence, power, however you want to conceptualize it, was normal in pre-colonized Caribbean. I'm from Kalinago, so otherwise known or seen in their colonized terminology as Carib Indians. That's what Columbus called them, right? This culture, this community, my ancestral bloodline, assigned power and influence to women. Women were in control of resources, of warfare strategies. They were the trusted individuals within these communities. They kept everything together and they continued to provide both powerful, sort of strategic, how do you conceptualize it, warfare tactics, but also had this nourishing element of love and support within them. Research into pre-colonial West Africa has also discovered, or rediscovered, shall I say, that communities often didn't assign gender through this binarized sort of anatomical lens. It was something that was decided later in life through the energy that one presented. It wasn't decided at birth and then used as a reference point for the rest of their life. Pre-colonial societies understood that gender and gender identity was something that was personal, individual, and had to be cultivated and continue to be cultivated. The dissemination of Western indoctrination not only took tangible resources, lives, and artifacts then in their pursuit of power and influence, they also took ideas, stories, and ways of conceptualizing the world, and with it, the divinity and multiplicity of masculinity. And in order for this patriarchal archetype of masculinity to be mainstreamed in the way that it arguably has been within our young masculinities, there had to have been a period of time in the history of humanity where ways of living and conceptualizing human existence were massacred from cultures and civilizations. There had to be periods of time where difference was scolded and punished in order to reinforce the narrative of this new norm. And we take for granted this singular idea of reality, right? The shared human experience that we all believe to be, everyone's in the same thing, get it, everyone's here, like, that's a Western invention, That's something that was created through this perpetuation of this singularity. And for me, reality is found in the context, experience, and cultural ideals that are passed into people across their lifetime. It is fluid, changeable, moldable. This was the reality our ancestors knew. But through this, how can I say, let me find my thoughts, because this is quite personal to me. This was the reality our ancestors knew, but because reality was standardized, binarized over time, because it erased numerous conceptualizations of the human experience along the way, and the singularity was the primary modality through which the world was constructed and experienced for the generations that followed, we perceive the singularity as normal, as right, as correct, as human. And anything that went against this norm was demonized, weaponized, and erased. Contempt killed our cultures. And the lifeblood of patriarchal masculinity, for me, is contempt. There is an unconscious and conscious hatred and fear of difference, and the desire to enforce a universal way of life onto and into people and cultures where masculine presentation is concerned. This contempt was a driving force in generations gone, and this contempt is still present now, because the fungus of patriarchal masculinity is still deeply embedded in the bloodstream of the wider zeitgeist. And if you don't believe that to be true, just go onto TikTok. Look at what is being reshared and spoken about in our classrooms. Andrew Tate isn't just a cult figure, he's a role model to a lot of men, young men in particular in these spaces. And we still view anything that challenges a norm, especially where masculinity is concerned, as dangerous, as harmful, as disruptive. And we protect and we push what we believe to be our ideas onto and into those that dare to defy this norm. And there's this misconception with colonial cognition, or how colonizers think. The colonized mind does not think solely with race. It thinks with unconditional uniformity and the preservation of the singularity at the core of its thoughts and its actions. This is where the multiplicity of masculinity, to me, was also removed from our ideas of men. And any presentation to this day that alludes to this multiplicity is mostly met with hostility. This is the wider cultural framework that we have created and are creating. And it's our responsibility to begin undoing the impact of this work, but not just for ourselves, but for the young masculinities who are beginning to define who they are, but are afraid of how these definitions may be perceived. But how do we go about doing this? To me, and to the Young Men's Conference, it starts with awareness. And I don't want to speak on anyone's behalf, but I feel like we're aligned there, right? It starts with awareness. It starts with acknowledging what it is that we are actually looking at and living through. It starts with men, Mandem in particular, yeah, there's a lot of people in here, a lot of Mandem in here. It's about taking accountability for their own explorative work and acknowledging some real painful home truths. I'm going to give you one right now, so strap in. We are all agents of patriarchal masculinity. We have all been infected and impacted by this fungus I speak of. We are all part of the virus, but we can be part of this vaccine too. But to begin metabolizing this fungus, we must begin challenging the apathy, acknowledging our unawareness. And in many ways, that is what we are here to do today. But we cannot undo generations upon generations of work and reinforcement in one day. I'm a realist, I understand this, okay? But what we can do is we can open our ears, our minds, and our energies to this explorative work, to the very challenging routes ahead, together. This is what we seek to do today, so keep in mind that it's not your job to establish these big long-term plans and become the savior of the story. It's to begin establishing immediate actions and behaviors that can be maintained long into the future. And there is a difference between those two states of mind that I just described. So, with that being said, we are now at Crossroads, where past ideas and conceptualizations intersect with the desire and hope for the future, where we have the opportunity to provide space for masculinities to thrive in their truth. And where we choose to go from here is up to us. But I do hope, truly, we are led in the direction of the perspectives and ideas that were lost, that were stolen, but can be reclaimed through our own explorative work. I hope that we discover and appreciate the power and truth found when we lean into the multiplicity and encourage authentic, aligned presentations. I hope that we gradually, over time, mainstream this multiplicity. Not just for us as men, not just for the people who experience our masculinities, but for the world to unconditionally house the magnificence and truth of all of its inhabitants. And with that, I will leave you. Thank you so much.